Hello and welcome to another episode of Ink and Paint, a podcast journey through the Disney animated classics. I'm your host, Daniel Lamon. We'll be exploring one by one the films in the official Disney animated canon and talking about their artistic, historical and social context, where they come from, their impact, and how they sit with us now. Before we start, I wanted to share this lovely message from friend and listener Keith Gow, who sent this in after listening to our most recent episode.
Hi Daniel, this is Keith Gow. I just wanted to thank you and the Ink and Paint team for 3 great episodes so far. And I really appreciate that you're asking the question, what do we do with these films now? Because it's really hard to imagine showing a child Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when a film like Frozen exists. Really great chat with Emma about Snow White, and I look forward to the next episode and all future episodes. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Keith. And that question is really one of the big reasons why we decided to do Ink and Paint in the first place. Any art form is constantly evolving, and so should our relationship with any single work of art, including ones we perceive as being created for children. It's a question that we'll definitely be asking throughout this whole project. If any of our other listeners want to send in their thoughts, listen in at the end of the episode for details, and we'll be sure to feature them in future episodes. Thanks again, Keith. In our previous episode, we began with the first film in the Disney canon, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first ever feature-length animated film. In this episode, the medium takes a gigantic leap forward with their second film, the beloved epic, Pinocchio. Each episode on Ink and Paint, I'm joined by a special guest, not just film and animation enthusiasts, but people from all different professions. This week, I'm joined by Sam Strong. Sam is an award-winning theatre director and one of Australia's most successful and influential arts leaders. He has been Artistic Director CEO of Queensland Theatre and Griffin Theatre, Associate Artistic Director of the Melbourne Theatre Company, Literary Manager at Belvoir, and the founding Dramaturg-in-Residence at Red Stitch Actors Theatre. As a director, Sam has created productions for all Australian state theatre companies and the Melbourne and Sydney festivals. Sam, welcome to Ink and Paint.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So our listeners, just give us a bit more about an idea about the kind of work that you make as a theatre director. What's the kind of stuff that you're generally drawn towards?
Yes, well, I mean, stylistically, I direct kind of across the spectrum of the sort of work that you tend to see on kind of Australian main stages. So I've directed a lot of classics or kind of reinterpretations of classics. I've directed my kind of share of kind of new international hits, the sort of plays that generally come out of London or out of Broadway. But my greatest passion is in new Australian stories. I consider myself a kind of dramaturg as well as a director, and so I do a lot of directing of new plays, particularly taking place to their world premiere. But also a really important part of my practice has been, I suppose, what you would call revival of contemporary Australian classics.
Yes.
So re-examining plays from the Australian canon. I know the canon is a sort of problematic term, but I've done quite a bit of going back to contemporary classics, plays that are about sort of 10 to 15 or 20 years old.
Considering this is a podcast talking about films that are considered classics, what do you think makes something a classic?
Oh, look, it's such a fascinating question. What makes something a classic? And one answer is a quite simple answer, and in some ways it's a cheats answer, which is of course longevity. I think if something kind of passes the test of time, then it becomes a classic. But I think there's 2 more interesting answers than that. I think, and one relates to works that do stand the test of time, and I think at least in a theatrical context, they're works that future generations of artists are drawn toward reinterpreting, drawn to coming back to, and are drawn toward making their own. But I think even more than that, and this is probably true of cinema and the screen as much as it's true of the stage and theatre, I think great works are works that somehow touch or access something archetypal or universal in their thematics. Interestingly, they tend to do that for the specific, but I think it's universally true of what you would call kind of classic works or arguably classic works, that they do all have that kind of archetypal, timeless quality.
It always feels like a very contentious question whenever it comes up in discussions around art and the canon and that kind of stuff. But it does tend to feel like if the classics kind of always feel like the works that have always been there, even if it's something that has been around for thousands of years or something that has been around for a few years. Like there are recent plays, films, works of literature that you would consider classics already, they just feel like they've always existed. They feel like they're speaking to something very deep down inside of who we are as a species.
Absolutely, and again, it's a little bit of a cheats answer, but they're all really good. And again, quality is a potentially kind of problematic term, but it is true of those works that are instant classics. Is they're all extraordinary works of art, and I think that does define them, whether they're 2 years old or 20 years old or 200 years old.
Well, speaking of works of art, one of the questions I like to ask on this podcast with our guests is, what was the very first Disney film you ever remember seeing?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think it's Fantasia, but my memory of that early generation of Disney films is slightly patchy, and it's true of Pinocchio, but I think it's slightly patchy because I probably encountered them a little bit too early. But maybe with Fantasia, I remember seeing the entirety of it. I remember seeing it in a cinema, which I probably, of course, probably the only way to see it back then. But my lasting impression of it was the kind of beauty of the sequences, obviously the kind of the interaction with the music, but also the kind of epic darkness of where it ends up going. I suppose it's fascinating in that where my own theatrical practice ended up going in terms of the importance of music or rhythm or choreography. That's actually a foundational experience.
It's kind of a well-worn anecdote now that it's, for a lot of people, it was their introduction to classical music, full stop. And so a lot of, around the time that they released the sequel, Fantasia 2000, a lot of the both the artists and the musicians associated with that particular film kept talking about how they had come to their craft because of Fantasia. I think it's the reason I fell in love with classical music as well. I saw it at quite a young age as well.
That synchronization of music to action, as well as being a wonderful introduction to all of the pieces that feature in it. I think there was something in that beautifully tight kind of choreographic synchronization of the animation to the music that stuck with.
And how much was Disney present in for both you growing up and has been present into your later life, into adulthood? Has there been a particularly present works?
I have I'm a really interesting generation in terms of Disney, in that I kind of missed a lot of the kind of mid-90s, because I was sort of finishing high school or something, but I missed that sort of tranche of films, and the kind of Aladdin, Lion King, Little Mermaid. I think they were all kind of mid-90s films off the top of my head. I missed a lot of those. I encountered some of these kind of classic ones early, and then I suppose I've had a bit of a renaissance through my son, who's now 5, and kind of back into Frozen 2, and that part of the Disney repertoire. So there's interestingly some holes in my kind of knowledge, which I'm looking forward to kind of going back to, actually.
Has Disney become a bit more present in the house because of your son? Like, is Disney something that he finds himself drawn to?
Well, absolutely. Yes. He's still fractionally young, I think. I mean, and again, I don't know. I suppose I just have an intuitive sense of that. I don't say that based on anything in particular, but I think as he starts to watch more of them, they will loom. Disney will loom larger. Actually, looking forward to going back to these early ones as well, with seeing how they hold up with him.
Well, speaking of the early Disney films, let's get started having a chat about this particular one. Walt Disney had gambled everything on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the gamble had paid off in spectacular fashion. The acclaim and financial success of the film opened up enormous possibilities for where he could take the studio next, his ultimate plan being production of a new feature-length animated film every 6 months. A number were already in development before Snow White was even released, including adaptations of Peter Pan and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but originally slated to be their follow-up was an adaptation of Felix Salten's novel Bambi. It quickly became obvious, though, that Bambi was beyond their abilities at the time, so attention was turned to another, a tale of a little wooden puppet who dreams of becoming a real boy. This film would push the medium of animation even further than before, and is now regarded as one of Disney's masterpieces. Woodcarver Geppetto, voiced by Christian Rubb, has constructed a wooden puppet he names Pinocchio, voiced by Dickie Jones, but wishes that Pinocchio was a real boy instead of being made of wood. His wish is granted by a blue fairy, voiced by Evelyn Venable, who brings Pinocchio to life but tells him that only through good deeds and bravery can he finally become a real boy. With his conscience's sidekick Jiminy Cricket, Cliff Edwards, Pinocchio begins to navigate the temptations of the world, making many mistakes along the way, until the consequences of his actions lead him on a mission to rescue a lost Geppetto from the belly of a whale at the bottom of the ocean. His bravery and selflessness lead to his wish finally being granted, and Pinocchio becomes a real boy. Pinocchio was based on the story written by Italian author Carlo Collodi, first in serial form in 1881 and later published as a book in 1883. It has since been translated into over 300 languages, making it the most translated non-religious text. Animator Norman Ferguson drew Disney's attention to the book, and he later said Walt was bursting with enthusiasm for it. In late 1937, before Snow White was released, Disney began to assemble a story team for Pinocchio. Almost immediately, the film ran into problems, particularly around Pinocchio himself. Early versions kept the character closer to Collodi's story, a wisecracking and strangely unlikable character, and initial designs strongly emphasized him as a puppet. None of this expressed the empathy or charm that Disney had hoped for. 6 months into development, he shut down production and ordered the team to start again. Young animator Milt Cole suggested that instead of approaching Pinocchio as a puppet, they should instead approach him as a little boy, and apply the physical aspects of a puppet afterwards. This new approach suggested a Pinocchio more naive, innocent and endearing, even human, and a more potent tone for the character in the film began to take shape. The film would represent a changing of the guard at Walt Disney Productions. The animators who had worked with the company on the early shorts, The Silly Symphonies and through to Snow White, were beginning to take a step back, and the younger animators were taking on bigger assignments. Pinocchio would launch the careers of many of the animators who would define Disney animation for the next 4 decades. So, Sam, when was the first time that you saw Pinocchio?
It's interesting in terms of the first time I saw Pinocchio, and I was trying to recall it, and I realised that I had seen it, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly when I did see it. And I remembered, I think I also had as was often the case with these films, a book version, a version that used the stills from the movie. So I actually can't place when I first saw it, but obviously in preparation for this chat, I had the kind of great good fortune of kind of coming back to it.
Had there been any kind of like textures or images or concepts from it that had, before you rewatched it, had any of them stuck in your mind that you could remember?
One of the interesting things about Pinocchio is, it is one of those works that lives or it feels like it's one of those works that lives in popular culture in a way that is in some degree of remove from the film. In that, of course, everyone thinks of Pinocchio as a story in which someone's nose gets bigger when one lies. And it was quite striking coming back to the film, or coming to the film afresh, and realising, though central, how small a part of the kind of overall narrative that is. I, like most people, probably had that kind of pop cultural sense of kind of what Pinocchio was about. And I think what was interesting about rewatching it is the image of kind of that transformed or transfigured Pinocchio with the kind of the donkey ear. Actually, when I rewatched it, I went, "Oh, this has been buried somewhere and has stuck with me." From when I counted as a child.
There's something surprising, quite primal about Pinocchio, and not just that particular section, but, and I mean, maybe it's also because, obviously, as is the case with most Disney films, the Disney version of these stories is the one that kind of overtakes in popular culture whatever the original version was. So certainly for most people, I think, if you think of Pinocchio, they think of the Disney Pinocchio, not necessarily the Collodi Pinocchio. But it's a film that kind of it does kind of bury itself in you because there's something very visceral about it. So, what was your impression of it? Revisiting again as an adult for this chat, what was your first impression of it?
I think, interestingly, my first impression changed over the course of the film. So, and in a way, it captures both impressions, and that was firstly how delightful it was, secondly how dark it is. And to talk about the delight first. I'd also forgotten that kind of When You Wish Upon a Star was originally from the film, so you have that kind of beautiful moment of recognition where you go, oh my God, of course this song belongs. I mean, I presume that's the case. Oh yeah, the song belongs to the film, but just also how kind of exquisite and beautiful that opening is. I mean, just the aching beauty of that song, and then the kind of the sourcing of that story in a kind of broader fairy tale context. Because I think, you look at that one of those early images when Jiminy's opening the book, and you've got kind of Alice in Wonderland there, and some other kind of great story there. But also, I think from memory, he says something like after he's finished the the song, he says something like "pretty, isn't it?" or something. He just and then he says this is about it. Then he just states the theme. He says this is just the most beautiful, as well as economical introduction. So I think I was struck by how beautiful the opening was.
The song very much grounds, because I mean, the risk with Pinocchio is that it can feel like an episodic story, particularly because it was a serialized story. And certainly, if lesser storytellers would not bother to try and find the connecting tissue between each of the episodes that happen within the story in the film. But by starting off with that very basic idea, like when you wish upon a star, the idea of longing, the idea of hope, the idea of perseverance through to follow your dreams, immediately grounds the idea of what the film is about in relation to his dream of, I want to be a real boy. So in a way, it's kind of, you're completely right, it gets you very much into the headspace of what kind of story we're going to be told in this and what the lens through which we should be looking at this story.
Absolutely. It's such a beautifully economical opening.
The story starts with our introduction to Jiminy Cricket and also Pinocchio. Another one of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you about this particular film is the fact that you have a young son. You know, what we were talking about in the preamble of the decision to not emphasize Pinocchio as a puppet, but instead emphasize him as a little boy and then add the attributes of a puppet on top of it. I mean, I've always thought that Pinocchio is one of the most beautiful depictions of what little boys of that age are actually like, the kind of naive, hopeful innocence of it.
Absolutely, and it is interesting coming back to it as the parent of a little boy. It is an absolutely exquisite, as you say, it's an absolutely exquisite portrait of the kind of wide-eyed innocence and kind of delight in the world, the kind of the questioning, and I think delight was, as I mentioned, something that absolutely struck me about the early parts of the film. And I think a key part of that is just how beautiful that child is. He's so cute. And everyone's cute. The work on Pinocchio as a young boy / puppet is so wonderful and beautiful, and I'm sure is such a kind of fundamental part of the work's ongoing appeal.
I've always thought that the animation around Pinocchio is the most beautiful character animation I've ever seen in any film. Like it's like it's the tiny details they pick up on in the way, like my favorite moment in the whole film, which is jumping ahead, is when he starts to sing I've Got No Strings after he falls down the stairs and everyone laughs at him, and he's kind of doing that thing of he doesn't quite know what to do and he's a little nervous, and he even starts, like, there's this moment where he starts scratching his leg. He's a puppet. He doesn't, there's nothing to scratch, he's just kind of trying his best and hoping that someone's going to, give him encouragement. I just, every time I watch this film, it just fills me with absolute joy watching him. And the great thing with that early section is that the world that has been designed for him to wake up into is a world full of detail. Like, there's so much for him to be responding to, not just Figaro and Cleo and Geppetto, but the clocks on the walls, the little details in the architecture. It's kind of like he wakes up in the middle of a fairy tale. He wakes up in the most idealized world he could, which gives a lot of scope to him to respond.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I think, being a parent, coming back to this story and watching your own child kind of discover the world or get distracted by the world or encounter things for the first time, or stop on a walk to observe something. I think it's a great point that he's plunged into a world that is kind of ripe for the discovery.
Isn't there that moment where Geppetto says, say hello to Figaro, and he just turns to Figaro and goes, hello to Figaro? Like, something as simple as that.
And even the detail, remember that detail where how Geppetto reacts to him and holds him like a puppet still, but of course he's not.
It's great watching all of them kind of have to reassess their relationship with him, because it's one of the things that makes Pinocchio the beautiful tension in Pinocchio is the way that everybody perceives that this is an object, but they also perceive this object has sentience, but they still treat it as an object. Like, that's the beautiful danger in Pinocchio, is that, like, he's, in a way, because he's made of wood, he's even more delicate than he would be if he was a living child, because he's only made of one element, an element that is, perishable. like that moment of him setting himself on fire is like, it's a perfectly placed moment, because the first thing it tells us is this character does not know how to exist in the world. It doesn't understand. It can make mistakes that can cause it real harm. And so like the potential for danger for Pinocchio exists at every turn. The only reason that he doesn't have that problem is that Jiminy exists. And I know that in the research I was doing, the reason that Walt, because originally the character of the cricket was like a minor character in the book, the reason that Walt Disney wanted to emphasize a sidekick character in the film was exactly that idea that Pinocchio doesn't have the moral compass or the understanding of the world to navigate it. He needs someone to help him do it.
Yes, and it's quite a masterstroke. He wouldn't really understand the full implications of the conscience and being led by your conscience that the fairy puts to him. And so, yeah, that sort of outsourcing of that to a kind of more mature character is a masterstroke, because it enables the theme to kind of resonate even more clearly.
The team at Walt Disney Productions had thrown themselves into the great unknown making Snow White, and the lessons they learned would carry over into production on Pinocchio, refining practices that worked, rethinking those that didn't, and finding new ways to approach new challenges this particular project would present them. An integral part of the process at Disney was the sweatbox sessions, where Walt Disney and his staff would review dailies and material. It was named for the small windowless room where the reviews took place during the early days at the Hyperion Studios, but later for the anxiety of the animators showing their work under Disney's critical eye. An early part of the process was a review of the story reel. Once the storyboards were completed and approved, they were photographed and constructed into a story reel accompanied by temp voices and music. This meant that the film could be reviewed in its entirety in rough form before the animation work began. The early reels were shot with a Leica camera, and so the reels became known as Leica reels. A stenographer would take notes during the sweatbox sessions, so full records of their discussions exist for posterity. During production on Pinocchio, the character model department was established, headed by animator Joe Grant. Their task was to approve the rough model sheets for all characters that were used as reference by the animators, as well as to create three-dimensional maquettes of characters and objects in the film. This included a working marionette puppet of Pinocchio, designed and manipulated by puppeteers Bill and Bob Jones, and working versions of all of the clocks in Geppetto's workshop. They also created working models of Stromboli's wagon and the coachman's coach that were used for rotoscoping. They were filmed as live action, rolling over a treadmill, then the frames were blown up to the size of animation paper and wash-off reliefs were made. The reliefs were then painted as you would with traditional cell animation and incorporated into the rest of the animation for the scene. If Snow White had been a grand experiment to see what was even possible in feature film animation, Pinocchio was a confident and rigorous step forward, a solidifying of the practices that are still integral to the process of developing and realizing an animated film. The really beautiful thing about Jiminy in terms of his development as a character is the fact that he is as much discovering everything as Pinocchio is. So when he gets the job, he doesn't know what it means to be a good conscience. I love that the first thing he does is he sleeps in. So he's not there for the moment where Honest John and Gideon pick Pinocchio up, which gives the film another great sense of tension, because it's another level of danger in that this character exists to be able to lead Pinocchio through the world, but we don't know whether this character is going to be able to lead him through the world, and he doesn't know if he can do that.
And it's true, isn't it? I've never thought of it that way, but you're actually tracking multiple heroes through that as well, like tracking Pinocchio, but you're tracking Jiminy. And I wonder if that is also part of the appeal of the film, and maybe it's what we're talking about at the start in terms of what makes something a classic. And having worked a lot on kind of coming of age stories in the theatre, I think one of the things that characterises them that they can speak equally. They find a way to speak equally effectively to adult and child audiences. And I wonder if that kind of dual protagonist thing of Jiminy and Pinocchio is actually a way of the film speaking equally to kind of adult and child audiences.
Yes, I mean that was something I also wanted to bring up, was the fact that a lot of the work that you've made, certainly in the last few years, have been about particularly young men, pre-teens in states of crisis. I mean, the work that you're working on now, the adaptation of Boy Swallows Universe, is a very similar kind of setup to Pinocchio. This idea of the transition from one state of the state of childhood into adulthood, which in a way could maybe be reflected in going from a puppet to a real boy, and the inherent dangers of being in a world that doesn't accommodate for what that transition means.
And I probably didn't necessarily realise that was such a strong through line of my my work until relatively late. And I'm like, yes, I'm actually working on multiple stories that are about young male protagonists, kind of journeys from some sort of kind of arc from kind of innocence to experience, or from childhood to adulthood, and realizing that the world, as you say, realizing the world is in fact kind of much darker, much more complex, much more difficult than they thought it was when they started the story.
Why do you think stories about those kind of characters have a resonance for us? Like, why do you think they're still they're necessary stories for us to be talking about and depicting?
I think one part of, there's a couple of answers to that. One part of it is that dual age appeal thing, where I think coming of age stories work for younger audiences because they can more immediately imagine themselves into the shoes of the protagonist. But I think they equally work for adult audiences because they can kind of retrospectively place themselves back in the shoes of the protagonist. And it's interesting that some of those stories do have that sort of adult framing device of looking back on something. I think that's part of it, but I think also, as we were talking earlier about kind of classic works that somehow access or touch the archetypal, I think coming of age stories document a fundamentally kind of human process, of kind of lightness to darkness, and of moving from and generally out the other side too. I should say to kind of hope and joy and kind of reconciliation at the end. But they're all dealing with a kind of journey from something that starts lighter and then goes much darker. And I think that arc pertains to parts of human experience other than strictly kind of coming of age narratives.
I mean, the journey that Pinocchio, in terms of a coming of age story for Pinocchio, I mean, it's his story starts in the warmth and the safety of Geppetto's workshop and this tucked up in bed, and ends in the belly of a whale at the bottom of the ocean. Like, it goes from warmth and comfort and closeness to something freezing and elemental and enormous, where he is dwarfed within this world. Like, in a way, I mean, the way that he sits within the workshop at the beginning, it's like he's surrounded by all these tiny things, and he's quite large by comparison. And by the end of the film, he's rendered this tiny, this tiny thing thrown against rocks and thrown against the waves. As far as kind of coming of age tales go, and certainly within the Disney animated canon, Pinocchio's is one of the most extreme examples of that. And it's not a particularly forgiving story. Like, there's this great quote that I found in a documentary on Disney, which from an art historian, Carmenita Higginbotham, where she said, "Pinocchio is just a wooden boy who is trying to be human. One would think that means he can make mistakes, that he would be allowed to have the faults of being a boy, and instead, any indiscretion is met with the possible death of his adopted father or the transformation into a donkey. The stakes are so very high." The scale of this film, even by the standard of a modern animated film, is kind of staggering. Like, the emotional scale, the visual scale, the oral scale, what it expects of its audience. And I mean, it's important to remember that, this is 1940. They're not making films for children, they're making films. Like, Disney was very specific about that at the time, that he was like, we're not making cartoons, we're making works of art. And so these films, like, even Snow White has kind of a lot more of an emotional range and emotional scope than you expect it to. But this one kind of pummels you from how forceful and emotional and unrelenting it can be.
I was incredibly struck by just how dark this film goes, and amongst many kind of very dark images in the film. But that kind of image of Pinocchio kind of drowned face down.
Oh, it's funny. I think that's the most horrific moment in the film. Like, of course, seeing the boys transform into donkeys in the moment where they're like ripping the clothes off the donkeys and throwing them into crates is really horrific. But it's that image of him because when he's face down in the water, he's not like, he doesn't look like a puppet. You can't see his wooden nose. You can't see his flat eyes. You can't see any of the attributes that remind us that he's an object, not a living thing. He looks like a little boy who's drowned in the ocean, which is a very upsetting and visceral image for us to see.
And interestingly, I was rewatching it again in preparation for the chat, literally before we were having this chat. And my son Henry came and watched the end, and he asked at that point. He said, "Is he dead?" And at first, that's the film doing exactly what you want it to be doing.
I mean, I did have a moment watching it, because I also watched it again just before this chat, and I did have a moment of looking at the image of, Pinocchio being dead, and I was like, but he has just spent the last however many hours walking underwater. Like, he is a piece of wood. He's probably not actually. It's a really in a lot of the research I was doing for the film, a lot of the animators were talking about how they had to keep manipulating the rules. Like, Jiminy should not be able to breathe underwater because he's a cricket, but he can. And Pinocchio can breathe underwater, but then he almost drowns. And then, like, there are lots of little moments in the film where they have to kind of bend the rules of a reality a little bit. But I mean, in the chat I was having in our very first episode, talking about the early Disney shorts, one of the things we were talking about, my guest and I, were the fact that the beauty of animation is that it doesn't have to be reality, that it can start to bend the rules a little bit. I mean, the film wouldn't be as potent if we didn't believe that Pinocchio has the capacity to die, or have the capacity to be seriously hurt. Otherwise, there's no tension in the film. And it's kind of wonderful that they're able to, in the course of the film, constantly kind of manipulate our relationship with it. And
I wonder if part of that too is, that great way in which kind of you can do anything if you do it with sufficient flair, or kind of panache will trump convention. And as you say, when you deconstruct that moment, you go, it sort of doesn't make much sense, because you've seen him breathing underwater, and logically you shouldn't be worried about him. But that image is so kind of searingly effective. That you forget all of that, and it just kind of hits you in the chest.
The single shot sequence early in the film that sweeps through the town as children are going to school was the most complex single shot ever achieved in animation at the time. As well as moving vertically through the animation, as would happen with a multiplane camera, it also moved horizontally at the same time. This meant that the camera and animation had to be able to move laterally, something the multiplane camera wasn't capable of. They adapted the process by completing the animation on giant glass panels, and rather than the camera moving down through the animation on a vertical plane, it moved forward through them on a horizontal plane. It is estimated that, not adjusted for inflation, the shot cost $48,000. It is still seen as a major technical achievement today. For nearly 50 years, the method behind this shot and many of the technical achievements in Pinocchio and Fantasia had been a mystery. The technicians and artists at the time had been so preoccupied with solving Disney's artistic challenges that they had not bothered to document their process. However, in 1990, a collection of notebooks were found in the home of recently deceased widow Ethel Schultheist, whose husband Herman had worked in the special effects department at the studio in the late 30s. Hidden and forgotten inside a Murphy bed, one of the notebooks turned out to be a detailed record of many of the techniques used during the making of the first animated features, including extensive photographs, sketches, and calculations. Schultheis had attempted to sell the notebook to the studio in 1939, but Disney hadn't been interested. Today, Herman Schultheis's notebook is one of the most valuable documents in the development of the medium and is regarded as the Rosetta Stone of Disney animation. The notebook is now on display at the Disney Family History Museum in San Francisco, and an annotated reproduction was published in 2014. Without it, we would have no idea how much of the incredible work on these films was achieved. Our relationship with Pinocchio now, for most animators and most film historians, it's still seen as maybe the height of hand-drawn animation, full stop. And so, yeah, well, talk to me about the visuals. Like, what were some of the things that really struck you about the visual storytelling in Pinocchio? Like, if you removed the dialogue, if you removed, the easy elements of exposition, how does it work as a piece of visual storytelling?
I think there's a few things. One is and we've touched on this before, but one is the quality of the animation, if you kind of pardon the term, of the otherwise inanimate object.
Yeah.
So the way that they're creating character and detail and human detail, I think is kind of incredibly striking. But I think what I found fascinating about it, and then it was interesting that I subsequently read something that kind of that affirmed it in terms of how novel this was at the time. But I remember that both the opening shot where you kind of you fly in over the town, as it were, and then that other kind of famous shot of the where you're again sort of moving your way through the town as the kind of kids go to school. I watched those, and I watched those without a technical appreciation that I subsequently got from reading about them. But interestingly, when I watched those, they reminded me of kind of large-scale contemporary filmmaking, or
Yes.
like that shot, like the shot in Atonement, or something that looked like.
Yes.
And it was interesting that way back then they're using animation to achieve these kind of effects that we're using other things to achieve now.
That's the beauty of these early films. Every single one of them are people at the forefront of an art form seeing what is actually possible with that art form. I mean, even down to things like one of my favorite shots in the film is the overhead moment, the moment where your perspective is overhead of Gideon and Honest John and Pinocchio when they're seeing Hi Diddly Dee and they're walking down the street, and it's this kind of tracking shot of them from an upwards POV, and it's just one of those moments where you remind yourself that this is something that a human being drew. This didn't exist until this group of human beings sat down and drew this onto paper and conceived of that. Like there are visual moments in Pinocchio that still blow my mind, that they could even have considered that as an option back then. I mean, the jump, one great thing about doing these films chronologically is that you get to watch the jump from each film to the next, and the jump from Snow White to Pinocchio is insane. Like I can't imagine a larger artistic leap in any field that I've come across than those two films. Because Snow White has this kind of beautiful storybook quality that is quite simple. Like, it's very direct. It's quite visually direct. The detail is exactly what needs to be there. Nothing more, nothing less. It's very economical, and that's certainly the same case with Pinocchio. But it's so much richer and it's so much more cinematic. Like, it feels big. And
it's interesting for me, looking at some kind of support material about Disney building the new studio, and you're right, that kind of aesthetic leap feels like people, a bunch of artists, not necessarily at the kind of mature height of their powers, but just with an extraordinary amount of kind of energy and dynamism and discovering something. It feels like you're hitting these people at their kind of at an incredibly sort of fertile point of their sort of creative lives.
It feels visually and artistically dangerous, a film. Like, when you get to films like Fantasia and Bambi, it becomes even more so. But there's something kind of fly by the seat of your pants about the way that Pinocchio works, like the way the visual language of the film works. I mean, even just the fact of the underwater sequence where Pinocchio and Jiminy are trying to find Monstro the whale, and that like insanely beautiful attempt at underwater, kind of creating an underwater photography, that was still being used as references for how to animate underwater in the late 80s when they did The Little Mermaid. Like, there are still animators still talk about how they will go into the Disney archives and they will look at how they did it. I mean, the whole concept of visual and special effects is pretty much born by them trying to work out how to do the Monstro and underwater sequence in Pinocchio. Not just for animation, but actual advances in special effects full stop are happening at the time with this film.
And do you feel like to me like there are parts of it where the kind of technological or visual possibility has actually sort of led the story? Like, if you're thinking about just the pure story of Pinocchio, that underwater sequence is kind of a little bit redundant.
Yes.
But fuck, it's beautiful. So it's a really interesting exercise, isn't it? Of you could potentially sort of dramaturgically cut that out, but it's so visually exquisite,
and it opens up the scale of it. I mean, it's that in a film that feels like it cannot I mean, once you get to the Pleasure Island sequence, you don't believe you go, how can the film be big? I mean, because also, thinking about the state of animation at the time, when the bar that you're working from is Snow White, where the locations are the castle, the dwarves' village, like the dwarves' house, the forest. Like there's so few locations in Snow White, and then you get to Pinocchio, and you have things like an entire island devoted to boys, mucking up. You have all of the sequence in Stromboli's wagon. You have Geppetto's workshop. You have the bottom, like the scale of landscape. Like that's another thing that's really beautiful in this film is there's such a sense of place and landscape. It's not a world that feels like it exists within a fairy tale. It feels like a living, breathing, functional world that Pinocchio is having to navigate through. Again, a dangerous world where anything can possibly happen. And again, stuff like all of it exists because someone put a pen to paper.
I don't know. I had an interesting experience where I was watching some deleted scenes, and of course, you see the detail of the kind of storyboards in the deleted scenes. That's just that wonderful reminder that of course, when you're in an animated universe, everything is storyboard, and how crucial the visuals are.
It was during production on Pinocchio that Walt Disney Productions moved from the Hyperion Avenue Studios to a new purpose-built facility on Buena Vista Street in Burbank. Walt had purchased the property without Roy's approval, and the box office revenues from Snow White funded the project. This new studio, still home of Disney Animation today, features state-of-the-art facilities for all aspects of the animation process, but the move was gradual rather than instantaneous. All of Pinocchio was still animated at Hyperion, but the camera and sound departments were the first to move, so that a lot of their work, including the score and vocal recordings, were completed at the new studio. Disney wanted his new campus to be the heart of animation in America, an artistic utopia designed specifically to deliver the best the medium was capable of. At the height of production, over 1,000 people were working for the company, more and more artists being drawn from rival studios and to study at the feet of the great masters. The studio even became a hub for visiting celebrities and dignitaries. Where the Hyperion studio had been a ramshackle set of dreams built on top of one another, Burbank would weave these dreams into a kingdom, with Disney as the benevolent head of state. Another aspect of the film that I wanted to talk about, because I know that you are also quite a big fan of musicals and music, because I know you and I have talked about them in the past, and I wanted to have a bit of a chat about the use of music and sound in Pinocchio, because I think the score and the songs in Pinocchio are absolutely exquisite, but all of it is there very much in it all serves the characters and the narrative. Like there's no waste in any of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the one of the things that struck me on re-encountering it was the way that the kind of percussive nature of a lot of the score and the way that it's sort of diegetically sourced into the story. So particularly around kind of Geppetto's workshop and the and the clocks. But yeah, I apart from being pleasantly surprised about kind of When You Wish Upon a Star, just the high diddly dee march, and they're great pieces of music, like really great standalone pieces of composition.
Yeah, I've had High Diddly Dee on repeat in my headphones for weeks. Because it's also one of those moments, both in terms of the song itself, but also the way that the song is used and visualized in the film. It just kind of leaps off. It feels like it should belong on a stage. It feels like it has such a beautiful theatricality to it. One of my favorite moments in the film musically is when Pinocchio is singing "I've Got No Strings." And, it's a really beautiful, very funny, very charming song. But there's something about the orchestrations that have this, like Lee Harlan's orchestrations have this very subtle sense of menace. There's never a moment in the music where you feel, apart from the moments in Geppetto's workshop at the beginning with, give a little whistle and all those kind of moments and all of the clocks, every other musical moment in the film has this underlying sense of dread. It's sometimes very, very subtle, but it never lets you forget that Pinocchio is not where he's supposed to be.
No, and it so carries the darkness of the film, doesn't it? That score, yeah.
With the end, talking about the sense of dread and the sense of foreboding. We've mentioned a lot about the darker themes in the film. What do you think they serve in this film? Like, why do you think they're there? Particularly something like the Pleasure Island sequence when we're watching these boys be turned into donkeys and locked into crates and, you know, told that no one's going to, like, no one cares about them and no one's going to miss them. Why do you think that has such potency and resonance, and why does it belong in this film?
Well, you know, in a way, what strikes me about the film is the way that it sort of makes concrete morality. So you know, the idea that if you lie, your nose grows, or that if you kind of, you know, you give in to sort of debauchery or excess, then you get turned into a kind of an ass. So I think that sort of Pleasure Island story is in some ways doing the same kind of, serving the same kind of concrete moral purpose that Pinocchio's nose growing is serving. But I remember I had no memory of that whatsoever. But when I watched it, I mean, I was of course struck. You know, when you come to that with a sort of contemporary lens, and the kind of the extent of the sort of the pedophilic overtones of that are surely the kind of 40s wasn't so innocent as to be kind of unaware of the territory that they were in.
Well, it kind of, the thing that I found, that the thing that struck me particularly the most recent time I watched it was the fact that the film, you know, the boys come onto the island and the boys are misbehaving, and the coachman talks about, you know, we're going to round up naughty little boys and take them to Pleasure Island. And so when you go onto the island, what you're looking at is the morality through the eyes of these boys, and going, they're misbehaving, they don't have a good moral compass, they don't have a conscience, and you kind of, knowing where the film's going, you start to you kind of trick yourself into going, well, they deserve what they get because they're clearly misbehaving. But the moment where the coachman starts, like, you know, he's thrown the first donkey that can't speak anymore into a crate, and he grabs Alexander, and Alexander speaks, and he throws him with the other ones. And all of a sudden I was like, is the film actually a message for adults and not children? Is this a comment on these? Because when push comes to shove, Alexander says, I want to go home to my mother. Like, I want my mum. And that's completely disregarded. They're too young to understand what they're doing. The responsibility of right and wrong in a child is not a child's responsibility, because they have to learn about the world they exist in. It's actually adults' responsibility to give them the moral compass and to be able to teach them to begin with what is right and wrong, but also be able to talk to them about what they have done wrong and lead them on a better path. So it's kind of hit me watching it that the most recent time, that maybe that scene is actually more about the fault of adults than it necessarily is the fault of children. That it's like, if adults disregard for the development of children and development of their moral compass leads to the inevitability that they're going to act like an ass. Like, that's what they're going to do.
I think it's a really fascinating way of looking at it, and I think you could probably take it even further in that you know, the kind of moral of Pleasure Island is sort of directed almost exclusively at adults, and it's a sort of conservative narrative about kind of temperance, probably, in a way, isn't it? Like, if you kind of give in to all of those bad things that you shouldn't be doing, like kind of smoking or smashing stuff or fighting, or, you know, then kind of bad stuff will happen. So yeah, I wonder if actually it is a sort of conservative moral narrative that's aimed at adults, rather than necessarily aimed at adults and their kind of moral guidance of children. It's almost aimed at the kind of moral guidance of adults.
Because, I mean, it still would scare the absolute shit out of a child, that sequence. Like, you know, I mean, we can have a talk about, you know, where it fits, where that can kind of fit now. Like, you know, can we tell those kind of stories in children's entertainment now? But I mean, for a child then, it would have scared the absolute shit out of them. So realistically, if it's trying to impart a lesson to a child, it's made its point. They're not going to forget that. If they already haven't had the point made to them by Pinocchio's nose getting long, which I remember as a kid, that fascinated me. And I was convinced that my nose, as a 4 or 5 year old, however old I was when I first saw it, I was convinced my nose was going to grow long if I lied. So I was terrified of the concept of lying. But the potency for an adult look like, and also, I mean, the funny, interesting about talking about, the kind of concept of temperance and the concept of, too much alcohol, too much tobacco, that kind of stuff. In the original book, it was originally like they ate candy. Like it was like the whole concept was originally that it was indulgence of like sugar and chocolate and that kind of stuff. And Disney was very specific that he didn't want it to be that. He wanted it to be alcohol and breaking things and smoking and all the things. Because, I mean, if you've got indulgences around sugar or indulgences around food, that's an indulgence we associate with a child and not necessarily an indulgence that a child can be properly punished for. The thing that's so unnerving about Pleasure Island is that these are children engaging in adult activities. By going to the island, they're being encouraged to leave their childhood behind, to no longer don't worry about how you engage in the world as a kid. This is you're play acting as an adult, like the way that Lampwick and like that moment where Lampwick says, "Let's go," and beat some people up, and Pinocchio throws away the ice cream in the pie and just starts to like imitate Lampwick's stance, which is so charming and so funny and so unnerving because he's a child.
But as you say, he's literally throwing away the kind of the vestiges of being a kid. No more ice cream, no more pie, and then I'll punch someone in the face.
And then like them in the pool hall is him play acting the role of an adult, play acting how, this is how an adult smokes and this is how an adult drinks and this is how an adult plays pool and all that kind of stuff.
And one of the other things that I really was hit by was the kind of visuals of Pleasure Island, particularly a couple of things. There's the way that the faces of the kids in the coach have this kind of Munchian sort of scream quality. Equally, then the sort of the dark helpers, feel like those kind of bad CGI ghosts out of Ghost.
Also, like they look like characters out of a Ghibli film, out of a Studio Ghibli film. Like that kind of, he is a dark force. It just has to be an amorphous. It just has to be an amorphous blob. And probably the reason why the kids' faces look like Munch's, scream in most of in the coach is probably just because they just didn't put detail into them. But the great thing is that the film is so like dramaturgically rich that you can look at every detail in it and everything. Like you can find a reason for everything in it. Because, and again, like that, you're being told you're going to somewhere called Pleasure Island. We've got the impression it's not good from the conversation between Honest John and the coachman. But the kids are all celebrating and the music's really lively and it's like it's a build up to some. It's similar to actually a film that was stuck in my mind a lot in this was, have you seen Spielberg's film AI Artificial Intelligence?
Oh, a long time ago.
It's basically an updated version of the Pinocchio story through Spielberg and Kubrick, and there's a very similar moment where they're going into what is essentially the pleasure island of that story. And Kubrick, in his notes before he died, very specifically wanted this very particular piece of classical music that was very grand and inviting and operatic and victorious as a way to enter into this world of debauchery in that particular case in that film and indulgence in the case of Pinocchio. It's almost like a way of kind of, diverting your attention away from, diverting your attention from, the last thing you expect is that these kids are going to start turning into donkeys. Like, that's not at all what you would think. And it's executed in a moment of genuine cinematic horror.
Oh, and the lamp transformation is like it's so effective. The way it takes the final step in that transformation into silhouette and the shadow on the wall, and you're like, that's much more the combination. You see, the moment where his hands become his hooves,
yes,
in kind of Pinocchio's face, and then the kind of final throwing the final gesture into kind of shadow. They're both such beautiful choices in terms of the kind of horror,
and it makes it very clear that the storytellers, the people behind this film, know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what effect they intend to have, and they're not going to apologize for what they want that effect to be. I mean, it's the thing of, if a film like Pinocchio intends to have a kind of moral purpose, which I think it does, the beauty of it is that it makes its moral purpose very, very clear. I guess that segues into a question of, does its moral like certainty and the kind of lessons that it's imparting, do they still have a place now? Like, how does Pinocchio read within the context of 2020 as opposed to 1940?
Yeah, I think Pinocchio's morality holds up pretty well, and it probably circles back to our original conversation about accessing something archetypal that makes something a classic, and because it's. I don't think it's particularly bound to its era, like that idea of I've momentarily forgotten the thing, but being brave and true and
the quote from the Blue Fairy of prove yourself brave, truthful, and unselfish, and someday you will be a real boy.
You know, it's quite beautiful, kind of what we would recognise as kind of, you know, classic kind of Christian ethics in a way, isn't it? Like, so it's or even just kind of good contemporary ethical behaviour. So I think you know, while the idea of kind of morality tales or tales that kind of have a kind of express moral in the ball cat a little now, I think the nature of its morality is pretty tame and hard to take issue with. But I think also, as you're alluding to, its clarity. It's beautiful to come to this work and just see how perfectly well stated and clear the work's kind of moral compass is. You know, you're in absolutely no doubt. It's really clear filmmaking and storytelling.
And all the more impressive, I think, when you consider the fact that it is only the second film of its form that existed at the time. That only one other film, only one other complete feature-length animated film of any kind existed before this, and that to have the second one be something as kind of almost biblical as Pinocchio is. Like, it has that kind of weight to it.
It's got the kind of, you know, a great sort of New Testament ethics to it, and a kind of great kind of Old Testament sort of vengeance to it, and with the whales. Well, but it is an incredible work of morality and ethics. I think that's why it stands up.
One last thing that I wanted before we finish our conversation about talking about Pinocchio, there was one quote that I wanted to bring up. I've actually had this quote in my back pocket for years. There's a fabulous documentary that PBS released a few years ago on Walt Disney. It goes about 4 or 5 hours. And there's a section on Pinocchio, the narration read out this quote from the New York Times in 1940 that I remember I remember bursting into tears hearing it, because it was just the most perfect encapsulation of how perfect this film is. So I want to finish off by reading that before we wrap up our conversation in general. The quote was this: Walt Disney has created something that will be counted in our favour, in all our favours, when this generation is being appraised by the generations of the future. For it will be said that no generation which produced a Snow White or a Pinocchio could have been altogether bad. Like, just a beautiful way of putting how impactful and beautiful a work of art this is.
And I think what I love about that quote too is it historicizes Pinocchio and kind of saves it from its era, when you go, you know, this film made when the kind of Third Reich is gearing up in Germany. Like, you know, there's some pretty dark stuff.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. I hadn't even considered the fact that it's, because I mean, I always think about it in being released just before the war because of its financial failure as a result. But yeah, I mean, it's a film released on the edge of oblivion.
Yeah, and the world is. I mean, obviously the world has fundamentally changed as a result of the First World War, but the world is about to, the moral compass of the world is about to kind of fundamentally shift again. And it's interesting that this kind of key work around ethics and morality comes out at that time. It's kind of, you know, it's sort of touching a zeitgeist that didn't even yet exist.
It's the perfect time for a film to talk about bravery, truthfulness, and unselfishness, and to encourage to wish upon a star and to dream to be a better person, to be a better version of who you are.
Absolutely, and a film that, like all of those great coming of age stories, even if it goes into some very dark terrain, it ultimately ends with a kind of affirmation of life and and hope and love.
Pinocchio took 2 years to complete, half the time but double the budget as Snow White. It had been an enormous emotional and financial strain on the studio and on Disney himself, who was delivered a devastating personal blow when his mother suddenly died of carbon monoxide poisoning in 1938. When it was released through RKO Pictures in February 1940, the critical response to Pinocchio was even greater than that for its predecessor, but the film bombed at the box office, only making $1 million on its initial run against a budget of $2 million. While Snow White was released as the Great Depression was coming to an end, Pinocchio was released at the start of the Second World War in Europe, and the loss of both the European and Asian markets, along with its enormous budget, are often cited as the reasons for its financial failure. The film had eaten away much of the profits from Snow White, and with the financial strain of building the new studio, Roy convinced Walt that the company needed to go public. In April 1940, they issued 150,000 shares, bringing in around $4 million for the company. As reassurance for their investors, a $1.5 million life insurance policy was taken out on Walt. Almost immediately, though, the fortunes of the film began to shift. It became the first feature animated film to win a competitive Oscar, with wins for Best Score and Best Song, When You Wish Upon a Star, a win the company wouldn't repeat again until Mary Poppins in 1964. And by 1954, the film had made back its budget through its first re-release. Today, Pinocchio is regarded as one of the greatest animated films ever made. It has been praised as a major technical achievement and a powerful morality tale on the nature of right and wrong, consequence and responsibility. 80 years after its release, it has lost none of its power, especially the sense of danger and the nightmarish images of Pleasure Island. With Pinocchio, wrote film critic Leonard Maltin, Disney reached not only the heights of his powers, but the apex of what many critics consider to be the realm of the animated cartoon. One last question that I have before we wrap up, which is a question I ask every guest on this podcast. Do you have a favourite Disney film?
I think there's a couple of answers to that. I think I'm the only person in the entire world that has never seen The Lion King. So I think I have, as I mentioned, I have some holes in my Disney knowledge. I think my favourite Disney film would still have to be Fantasia, and I think maybe that's because of the first one I encountered in its entirety. But it's, as we were talking about before, I think it's the introduction to the power of music, but it's also an introduction to the kind of the power of the synchronization of music and movement, and without even really knowing it at the time or even for lots of years after that, I think that film served a vitally important role in my kind of development as an artist and kind of in the evolution of me as the kind of theatre maker that I ultimately became.
Totally. I have exactly the same relationship with that film. Like, I feel like it's hidden in everything I make in some capacity, Fantasia. Like, it's the one of the films I've probably watched the most out of all of the Disney canon. I mean, I'm jumping ahead because obviously Fantasia is the subject of the next episode, but like I said to you before this recording, I've watched it 4 times in a week. And every time I'm completely arrested by it.
I need your advice about what I should be watching.
To be honest, I've found one of the things, the idea of going through them chronologically was something that I've been thinking about doing for years, because I wanted to be able to see what the trajectory of the art form was. And one of my favorite film podcasts, Blank Check, last year did a mini-series on Hayao Miyazaki's films, and they did them chronologically. So I decided to follow along with them, and I watched all his films chronologically, and that really kind of encouraged me that that's what I wanted to do with this. So I'd actually say start from the beginning and just go through. I mean, the great thing is, basically you start with 5 masterpieces. Snow White's a masterpiece. Pinocchio is one of the greatest films ever made, as is Fantasia. Dumbo is incredible, apart from one aspect. And Bambi is an absolute work of art. And then it's both. I mean, something I'll say a lot on this podcast, but like the story of Disney animation is the story of animation itself, because of their prominence. But it's also kind of also the story of 20th century history. I mean, like you pointed out with Pinocchio, like this is a film coming out just as the war has started and Nazism is on the rise. And where does the film fit within that context? So yeah, I'd just say start from the beginning and go through all of them. Get Henry, sit there and, maybe cover his eyes for, bits and pieces. But, All right, Sam. Well, thank you so much for being our guest on Pinocchio. I hope you enjoyed revisiting the film and enjoyed having a bit of a chat about it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great treat to come back to the film.
In 1940, Walt Disney did not know what Pinocchio's legacy would be. Many believed he had transcended the artistic successes of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but despite the gargantuan work involved and the tremendous evolution of the form, he was now dealing with his first box office failure. There was no time to take a breath, though. He now turned his attention to the remaining slate of films, including the adaptation of Bambi and a new small-scale project about a baby elephant who could fly. Before that, however, would be the most ambitious technical and artistic film enterprise he would ever embark on. One that attempted to solidify animation as a legitimate art form, would change the technology of cinema itself, and bring the company even closer to the edge of collapse. On the next episode of Ink and Paint.
And it all goes into red and black and white. Oh my gosh, it's so Scorsese.
I'll be joined by composer and conductor Ashley Clapp for the first of our two-part episode on the monolithic animated masterpiece, Fantasia. Thanks again to Sam Strong for joining me on this episode. You can follow Sam on Twitter @SamStrong. Be sure to check out the show notes on this episode at inkandpaint.com.au for more information about the making of Pinocchio, including concept art, animation sketches, and information about the history of the film on home video. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the podcast. Hit us up with your comments, questions, or even memories of your favourite Disney films, and we'll be sure to share them on our upcoming episodes. You can email Daniel at inkandpaint.com.au or find me on Twitter @DanielLammon. We release new episodes every fortnight, so if you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform. And don't forget to tell your friends. Ink and Paint was created, hosted, and written by myself, Daniel Lammon, and produced and edited by Alex Amster. Original music is composed by Sam Porter. The show artwork is designed by Nicholas Piranakis, with episode illustrations by Lily Meek, and the podcast is released through Switch. maketheswitch.com.au. Join in next time on Ink and Paint to continue our journey through the Disney animated classics.